Hello everyone. The topic of this tutorial will be creating a calibration report. This is possibly one of the most useful features of our tools is to help post-calibrate your instruments. Once you do that, then you can go back on board and tune your electronics and then obtain better numbers while you're sailing. Let me start RaceReplay. And the side effect is that if you find calibration values, you can also post-calibrate your log and still derive good performance analysis information. So let's wait for RaceReplay to boot up. I've started it with the basics. We just have a log and a polar. So here's our track for the day. Now the calibration report, which we will see shortly, comes in 4 different sections. The first section will be mostly about calibrating your speedo and your compass. The second and third section will be about calibrating your wind instruments in function of looking at offsets and your true-in angle changing from tack to tack or your true-in direction. And finally, there's a 4th section which we will not cover in this video, which discusses what happens when you change a sail. As you might know, when you put up a spinnaker, there's some upwash, wind upwash that goes into your wind instruments, and that might induce some errors in the wind measurement. So without further ado, let's get started. We've got RaceReplay running. I have a track, and as we can already see, so this was a windward leeward, the wind being from the north here. And you can all see that RaceReplay has auto-detected a couple of tacks and jibes. Typically, these tacks are little circles, orange circles, and jibes are little yellow squares. Some of them have just a dot. Some of them might have a dot with a circle around them. And we'll go through that shortly. So the first thing you want to do is to go over each of these tacks. So the best way to do that is to open the tack and jibe table, go into View, Panels, Tack jibe table, and here is the list of all the tacks and jibes that RaceReplay has pre-validated for you. If I uncheck this hide invalid, you'll see there's many more. They're crossed out. It means that RaceReplay has already determined they will not be useful either for calibration or for performance. Each of those tacks and jibes can have 2 settings. They can be valid for calibration and or for performance. A tack and jibe must be valid for calibration before it can be valid for performance. So the first step you should go through is go through each of your tacks and jibes as follows. Select the first one and right click or double click on it and click on Properties. Now I get this window coming up with a bunch of statistics about, in this case, it's our first tack. So here it is. What we have here, first of all, is some summary about the tack where the sail was up. In this case, I haven't input any sail, so there's no sails up. It's a tack that was going from starboard to port. It's got some information of distance lost, but we're probably not going to get into that in this video. This is only valid once you've properly calibrated your data. Then it's got some information of how it actually analyzes each maneuver. And we can see that it's going to take 30 seconds time once, which means they're like little phases before and after the tack. These are going to last 30 seconds, and then it's going to check at 10 seconds before. So the gray wand is 10 seconds before the tack being a change of sign of true-in angle, and it's going to go look 60 seconds after. And in both cases, at those timestamps, -10 and +60, it's going to take an average of 30 seconds in our case. So this is the graph here shows us the data before and after the tack. There's also a graph called VMG gain, which I'm going to hide for now as it's more advanced and we don't need it for calibration. Now, then we have a little chart that shows you the before and after. It's always interesting to see because this will quickly tell you if the boat was bearing away too low, or if it was in a pre-start, it might have come out of attack and started reaching. All these are maneuvers that will not be interesting in terms of calibration and performance. At any time, if you go over those tacks and jibes and find that RaceReplay probably incorrectly or had a false positive, as in it thought it might be okay, but you feel it's not, just uncheck that calibration, and it will disappear. It will not be taken into account in the calibration report. Let's check this back. Now we've got some numbers here, which are the average values of the before and then after. Now we're not going to look at those into too much details because at this stage we're working on calibration. For a good calibration, all we want is to make sure that it was a proper tack in the sense that you were going upwind before in a steady state, upwind after in a steady state. So you now have the possibility to move those wands around and try to find, by default in this graph, I've got boat speed in red and I've got a true angle in blue. I just want to try to move the tack back to a place where it was pretty stable before and after. So that's done for this tack. I can now move on to the next one. Similar operation. I'm quite happy with where it took the RaceReplay took the wands. I don't feel I need to move them. Now we're getting into a jibe. Now this jibe I probably look for a bit more stability after. And then finish off doing that. This one looks a bit fuzzy. There's probably a lot of moving around for the boat. So I'll keep it anyways. Here's another tack. I'm going to find, once again, move on to finding steady places before and after. And another one. And we'll do that for the whole process. As you see, I've actually left all the tacks I've seen up to now. I've considered that they were actually valid in terms of stability before and after. There was nothing like a big bear away or anything like that. So theoretically, RaceReplay does a pretty good job of eliminating bad, like invalid tacks and jibes. So there's no need to go look at those invalid ones in theory. But that being said, you should still go over all the valid ones and make sure they look stable enough. Here's another little hint. When we opened this up, there were some default values for your tacks and jibes. These default values are set in Tools Options, and if you go to Maneuvers, you got a tack jibe calculation, and all the default values are set here. If I was to move them, to change those now and click OK, it would ask me, do I want to recompute everything? In which case I would lose the work I just did. By the way, whenever I do all this, adjusting all these things, I'm actually doing some analysis. So don't forget to constantly save your event file. I'm going to overwrite my current event file because all this information of where are my tacks in, all my moving of wands are going to get saved in the event file. That means that once I've saved the event file, if I close RaceReplay, reopen it, except this time I specify an event file, all this work will be saved. Next step we might want to look at is mark roundings. Mark roundings are little light blue and darker blue triangles with a point up or down. So in the same way, I can go into View, Panels, and look at mark rounding tables. And in that case, I will do the exact same exercise. It's found 2. Look at the first one. And all I want here is to make sure that I'm taking steady phases before and after. That way, when I'm going to average my numbers, I'm going to look at how the wind speed increased from since I was downwind to when I went back upwind. I just want to make sure it's when a boat was in a steady state and the electronics had stabilized. And we possibly have a top mark here, so probably go a little bit before. Make sure everything is nice and stable. There's probably a spinnaker set up, so let's wait a little bit further here. Okay, that's good. Right, done for the preparation work for tacked jibes and maneuvers. Next step is we need to create some phases, and these are normed phases. So let me get rid of those 2 wands here. And I now want RaceReplay to cut up a lot of places where the boat was in steady state, straight line sailing. The best way to do that is to go into Tools, Phases, Create. We're going to call them normed phases. So it's going to ask me where on the track do I want to create those normed phases. I want to create it over the entire track. and I want my phases to be 30 seconds. Now the duration there will really depend on the type of boat you have. If you have a fast-moving boat which accelerates a lot and which might do a lot of moving up and down to accelerate and play with the shifts, you'll probably need a smaller phase. If you've got a big, heavy boat that's very, very stable, that takes time to build, but once it's built, it's really stable, you might move on to a more 1 minute. It also depends on the type of course you were running. Offshore, you might take 5-minute phases. So this is really, you'll have to find your feel for that. Click OK. It has tried to cut up 30-second phases everywhere it could on the track. We don't see them yet, but it's cut up 30-second phases everywhere except around tacks and jibes and around sail changes if we had any, and around mark roundings. So anywhere it could, it tried to fit in a 30-second phase. So I've immediately have statistics about how many phases it found in total. It's found 73. Now, these include phases in the pre-start where the boat was moving around a lot, which means that we now have to go through this algorithm and help it filter a bit more. So on the basic level, I'm going to say I want phases upwind, downwind, and reaching. This algorithm is also used for other purposes when I just want to create phases for upwind, not necessarily for calibration. In our case, we're interested, in fact, I'm going to remove reaching. We're only interested in upwind and downwind. So immediately my statistics of what RaceReplay is proposing to create gets updated. Out of 73 it's found, it's proposing to create 66, and I've even got the details on how many are going to be upwind, downwind on port and starboard. On this basic tab, I can also specify that I want for both tacks. Then I can specify that it must have a mainsail plus at least one sail. I'm not going to check that because once again I haven't put any sail events. And there's a whole bunch of things I can tell it that if there was a technical problem or a race start event, I can tell it, please don't take any phases within whatever time you specify of that specific event. Let's move on to the value range. We can force it to say that I only consider a phase. I'm only going to be interested in phases that have good VMG, and for me, good VMG is at least 90% VMG percentage. The second I clicked that, it dropped from 66 to 59, so that's probably a good thing. And then last tab, stability. You can add as many stability variables as you want. The way this works is, let's look at boat speed. We now have 59 phases, active phases that are going to get created. These phases are 30-second long. This is a 30-second, and this is a 1-second log. So each phase has 30 points. By specifying a stability for boat speed, I'm saying that if for every phase that I find that has 30 points, I will not tolerate a variation of more than 1.1 knot of boat speed for all upwind phases. And as I get more stricter, like I'm saying, if I only want 0.5 knot variation, you'll see that it's dropping. It's now dropping phases, and I'm getting stricter. Now, this is something that you will have to play with and try to find what is the right value of stability. Typically, it will depend on the boat, but also on the day. Was it a light and shifty day, or was it a medium, really steady day? Depending on those criteria, you will have to adjust those factors. And the idea is, I want to get enough phases that I can do some calibration, but also I don't want to have too many that there's going to be some phases where in fact there was a lot of moving around. So once again, the three main factors I use, and you're welcome to add any factors of stability, are boat speed, as I mentioned, true wind speed. If the wind was varying too much during those 30 seconds, it's probably not a very interesting phase. We were trying to adapt too much. And heading as well. Heading will remove heading variation. Having a stability factor on heading will remove any phases which, for instance, were in the pre-start. Here, upwind, I'm only allowing for the boat to have moved about 10 degrees during 30 seconds, which is probably typical for my boat. on an upwind leg, and it's not typical at all in a pre-start. In a pre-start, a boat will circle around. All these phases will get eliminated. Once I've done all this, I'm satisfied with what I'm left with, and I will click OK. The phases are now getting created by RaceReplay. They appear on the track, and they appear in my phases table. Once I've done all those operations, tack and jibes, top mark, bottom marks, creation of valid phases, I can now go into creating my first calibration report. And I will click on the menu Report, Calibration Report. It's offering me some options. These options, once you set them, once I've explained how they are, at any time you can save them and in order to call them back next time you do analysis. So as mentioned, there are 4 sections to the calibration report, and then there's some miscellaneous report options. In the speedo calibration, it will by default display some variables, but I would like to see some other variables such as cog and possibly heading. In the tack jibe calibration, there's some default variables. I'm going to add a few more. Apparent wind speed and possibly heel. Mark rounding is good as. Sail changes, I'm not going to enable this section of the calibration report. This will be in a future video. Once all done, click OK, and RaceReplay starts working on the calibration report. It's asking me to save it. I've already got something in there. I'll overwrite. Doing a bit of work, bit of calculation, and it's opening an Excel file. On my secondary window. And there it is. Bring it down into view. So let's make a bit of space. So here's my Excel with my calibration report. Section 1, it's called boat speed, but in fact it also serves for heading, for compass. Then there's a section about tacks and jibes, and then there's a section about mark roundings. Let's go through these quickly. First of all, it's got boat speed calibration section. There are 2 subtables, one for upwind, one for downwind. And then these are subdivided into port and starboard. As a hint, this has got averages of phase averages. So in fact, if I unhide this section, you will see that I've got one line for each phase that was, in this case, upwind, port, tack. And then I've got that pink line, which is the average of all these. Same thing for upwind on starboard, and same thing for downwind. So let me get back to the summary. So first thing I will look at is how many phases I had on port and starboard. 12 and 11, that's pretty good because it's balanced, and so that means it's going to be interesting to look at. I'll have a quick look at truant speed. There's a bit of a variation from port to starboard, but we will get into that in the sections below, so I'm not going to look at it too much. Heel, now that's always interesting because for me this is a good indicator of whether there was a lot of wind shear or if the wind was a bit strange. Typically on a wind shear day you should have quite different heel from port to starboard. That's not the case, and for me that's a good sign that I should be able to compare data from port to starboard. Now it's got averages of boat speed on ports and starboard and of speed over ground, and then I've got a delta of boat speed minus SOG and a boat speed over SOG percentage. Now this is very interesting because I can see that on port tack it was the boat speed was reading a little bit faster than the SOG, and the starboard tack a little bit slower. Now I will have to put this in perspective with the current. If I knew there was a bit of current coming from maybe the right side of the course, then I do expect my boat speed to be a little bit higher than my speed over ground. And for me, these numbers are very valid. 101%, 99% for my boat. I know that it means that there's definitely no major issue with my speedo. Then I can also look at heading and cog. So here I can see there's a little delta between heading and cog. But once again, because I'm getting roughly -4 on one side and +4 on the other, I know that my boat has around 4 degrees of leeway when it's going upwind, so this is actually very reasonable. There's no indication that there's a compass issue at this stage. That might not be the case for you. If there's a big delta and it's not anti-symmetric from tack to tack, then first of all we'll have to look at, is there any issue with current? And secondly, then you'll have to drill down and possibly look at in detail at different compass values, what was the cog in case there was no current. This could be an indicator to help you correct your heading table. Next section, I'm looking at tacks and jibes. Now what I'm going to be looking at mostly here is my true wind direction from tack to tack. First of all, I'm going to validate that my true wind speed from tack to tack is pretty good, and then my true wind direction. Now, because there's quite a large delta here from tack to tack, it's always reading a bit more to the right on starboard. And I can also see that on starboard it's got a slightly more open true wind angle, and that's also true for the apparent wind angle reading. This is an immediate indication for me that maybe my wand is not perfectly aligned, and in that case I probably would correct my electronics and say move the wand about, it's got to be about half of that delta true wind direction, and so around 3 degrees to the, or sorry, the true wind angle, around, let's say 0.7 degrees more to the left. And in that case, I should hopefully get a true wind angle which gets symmetric, and that would get the true wind direction more symmetric tack to tack. I can do the same exercise with jibes, but jibes is always less stable, so I expect more noise, and I usually trust more my numbers upwind where everything is stable, there's no upwash for my sails. And then the last section, mark roundings. Mark roundings typically will let me know if there is a true wind speed offset that I should apply, usually when I'm downwind. Typically in the electronics we are going to assume that the true wind speed reading is correct upwind where there's no upwash, and so we will tend to correct downwind. In my case, I've got a bottom mark and a top mark, the values before and after, but I'm also displaying the true wind speed upwind and the true wind speed downwind. In the case of the bottom mark, the true wind speed downwind came before, but that's irrelevant. I just want to look at the delta of upwind, of downwind minus upwind. In our case, I only had 2 maneuvers, so it might be a little bit short to come to hard conclusions. Nevertheless, I've already got a trend. Downwind, my true wind speed is reading around 1.5 knots higher than upwind. So if I had more maneuvers confirming that, or if I had the same information over a couple of days, that would be enough for me to go in the electronics and suggest that whatever reading of wind speed downwind, I should subtract around 1 knot in true wind in around 13 to 14 true wind speed. Usually in the electronics you'll have a table saying at this true wind speed level how much should I subtract or what coefficient should I apply. Make sure you're not applying it over the whole range of wind, but obviously to the range of wind that we've been looking at. And this completes the video on your first calibration report.